Professor Wergely's here. The URL is all ready to go. Now we can load the URL and prepare to get the results back. So how do I do that? If I scroll up, I actually have a URL here as a global variable. So we can use that URL. So we can say URL is equal to new URL. So we'll instantiate the URL class and we'll provide the URL string. Now, normally this won't work directly. I have this throws exception here at the top. So we should actually remove this throws exception while we're developing, and we'll put it back here in a little bit because you'll see this creates a compiler error. And what is it saying? It's saying, hey, you're supposed to catch a malformed URL exception. And remember, the superclass for all exceptions is the exception superclass. So I put throws exception up here at the top. No matter what error I experience in the code, it's going to handle them all. But the problem is I'll lose some information. I want to throw the exact error that's going to happen with this URL. So I'll surround the statement with a try catch. You'll see it kind of put it in the wrong position. I want the catch to be way up here. And now if a malformed URL exception occurs, I'll actually get that corresponding information. And then we can throw it back. That way the controller can have it so it can let the user know what happened. So I actually throw that exception here. So I'm actually going to leave this off while we keep developing to make sure that it works correctly. So when I load this URL, what's cool about it is it's actually going to put it in the browser, so to speak, but it's not going to execute it just quite yet. It's creating the URL. It's ready to be executed, but it's not going to be executed until we call open string. So I can actually uncomment some of this code here. I have a lot of the code written to help speed up some of the development. Now this is just basic code. I have a JSON string. I have a buffered reader. This buffered reader is going to read line by line from the URL that we're going to open. In order to open this URL, I need to use an input stream reader. Okay, you may have remembered an input stream reader when we did serialization. The input stream reader is going to use the URL, and they have an open stream method. Now, what this is going to do when I do open stream is it's actually going to go to like what we did in the browser. It's going to pull all this JSON data. So you can imagine this is what I'm going to get back when I do URL open stream. I'm going to get back all this JSON data, and I need to loop through line by line. So I have a buffered reader and I have a line. I'm going to loop through line by line the size of the buffered reader, and I'm going to add it to the JSON string. Now using a plus equals is not very efficient because every time I add a line, it deletes this string and creates a new one. Remember, the string class is immutable. Do you remember what immutable objects are? If you don't, make sure you go back over and study that for the final exam. Immutable objects, object in Turing, unboxing, and autoboxing, those are all going to be tested on the final exam. So you want to go back over that information. Anytime you modify the string class, the old string is destroyed and a new one is created. So every time I add a line, I destroy the entire string and I create a new one. And I have to write the string all over again. So it would be more efficient, let's say you're on a job interview, would be to use a string builder and call the append method, which does not destroy the string each time. You'll see here I close the input. Once I'm done reading all the lines of the JSON, go ahead and close the input so I don't have a memory leak. Now this could have a problem. I may have an IO exception. Maybe the data that comes back from the JSON is corrupt, or maybe the URL is down, or maybe the API blocks my request. There could be a lot of things that go wrong here, as well as this malformed URL. So I have an IO exception here. As long as the IO exception doesn't occur, I'm going to go ahead and print out the JSON string. Before I parse it, let's print it out and let's see if this runs. In order for this to run, I need to add my throws exception back. Okay, once the throws exception is back, you'll see this code works. So I'm creating the URL based off what the user inserted, but I'm not going to use the raw inserted string. I'm going to encode it first to make sure it's treated as a string. I printed that out. Everything looks good. I create the URL. If anything happens, I'm going to throw the exception, and I'm going to load the URL. I'm going to loop through line by line and store it to my JSON string. And if this works, I'm going to print out a big JSON string to the console. So we can save this and actually run the application. Okay, what happens when I run the application? So I'm going to run it. Here's what you'll see. I'll type University of Missouri. Okay, I'll click go. You'll see the URL occurred, and it took a second because it takes a little bit for the API to load. And then look at this big JSON string. You'll see status okay. Here's the copyright. I can actually copy this whole string and put it in a JSON reader and make sure it came through correctly. Okay, so if I do viewer, I have invalid JSON. Most likely that's because I didn't copy the entire thing. So let me try to copy the whole line. It's a long line, so it may take some time. You'll see actually it didn't even print out the whole line. It's too far. It's too long. You'll see this line is too long. Please switch to wrap mode. Okay, please switch to wrapped mode if you want to see the entire line. Okay, I'm going to assume it's okay. We loaded the JSON. I'm going to assume it's okay. Once we have the JSON, we need to parse it. Now remember, with JDK 8 and before, it didn't have a good way to parse JSON. JSON is usually for JavaScript, but it's becoming popular. It's being used by all languages. So I had to use an external third-party library called JSON Simple. Now, I talked about this library back in the serialization lecture. So if you don't remember this library, go back and watch the object serialization lecture. I go extensively into this library. It's a great library to parse and read in JSON. It's also a great library to create JSON. But it's not part of the JDK, so we need to use it as an external third-party library. So I'm going to put these lines of code back. Okay, you'll see parse JSON newsfeed. We can go over this method, but we're going to do it in the next video. Stick with Professor Wergeles, and we'll see you in the next video.